Hey everybody, this is Becca. Thanks for watching my channel, BeccaTownSims. Today we are going to be looking at my speed build of the Laurence mansion, and we're also going to be spilling some historical tea, or should I say molasses, about a very interesting, honestly it was a tragedy that happened near me. So we're going to be talking about the Boston Molasses Flood today, and I'll explain what that is and why we're talking about it in just a second. But first I'm going to tell you babies about this build. So this is the Laurence mansion. It is based off of Laurie's mansion from Little Women. So if you guys haven't seen my other videos, I'm going to be doing a thing with Little Women soon, and I built the house that the sisters live in, and now I'm building the mansion that their hot neighbor Laurie lives in. So I based this a little bit off the movie. I found a still, and they also filmed some scenes in Massachusetts. So this is kind of a real house, but they used interiors from a different real house. So anyways, I looked at a couple reference pics, combined them, and then went wild, mostly on the inside, to make this historical house, which is kind of a colonial style, a little bit neoclassical. But yeah, it's not that complicated. It's very symmetrical. 5 bedrooms, big place. Download it, whatever. Anyways, I want to tell you guys about the Boston Molasses Flood. So I've only recently started chatting at you guys about like historical scandals, and this isn't exactly a scandal because it doesn't involve one specific person who did crazy stuff. This is just a crazy thing that happened in Boston. So this is a true story. And I live near Boston, by the way, not exactly in the city, but I've been where this happens. I'm going to tell you all about it, but first, let's lay the scene. All right, babies, it's 1915. We're in World War I that started last year. The army is giving people a bunch of money for alcohol, which could be distilled from molasses. So there's this company, the Purity Distilling Company, and they decide that they're going to make bank by buying molasses and turning it into alcohol. There's another thing happening, and that is prohibition, when they banned all the alcohol in the US. So that's coming up soon, and the Purity Distilling Company knows it. So in 1915, they're like, let's make bank. Let's buy this molasses. Let's turn it into alcohol really fast before, we become a dry nation. There was going to be like a grace period from when it started too, so they had a little bit of time to do their distilling, and they could just have just a buttload of alcohol. So they go to Boston, to this pretty industrial neighborhood where there were a lot of poor people living. This is the North End now, which is super touristy, but it's also the Italian neighborhood. And back then, I don't know, people were, can you call it racist? They were just racist against everybody. It didn't matter what you were. So they were definitely did look down on the Italian people. They decided to build this huge molasses tank right in the North End. And when I say huge, I mean this thing was like 4 stories tall. It was enormous. It was taller than all the buildings around it, just like a giant can of molasses basically against the city. So the person who built this was not a builder or an engineer or an architect. This company, and I don't know if you guys knew this, but companies are often evil, and they do not care about anything. So this company hired this guy with no building experience, and they're like, hey, you want to make us a big molasses tank? And the guy was like, yeah, sure, my background is in finance or something completely irrelevant, but I'll build you a tank for money. So they gave him a wad of cash, and he built this huge tank. And guess what? He didn't do a very good job. This type of steel that he used, by the way, was the same type of steel that had been used on the Titanic. And I don't know if you know what happened to the Titanic, but it wasn't pretty. So they use that type of steel. They're going to store just 4 or 5 stories worth of molasses in it. The steel, apparently, doing modern studies on it, was only half as thick as it should have been, and it didn't have the right chemical ingredients, there wasn't enough manganese or something in it, so it had this propensity to turn brittle. And you don't want brittle steel because it's gonna break at some point. So they built the tank, and almost right away it starts leaking to the point where like the kids in the families, like the kids would like roll up and like start licking the tank or whatever, get some sticks and like roll it up and make some molasses lollipops, and like the townspeople come by with their bucket and be like, guess we don't have to buy sugar, we'll just like get it from this big leaking tank. And people said that every time they put molasses into it, it would like groan and creak and shudder. And this one guy who worked there like found a shard of steel that had come off of it somehow and showed it to somebody, and the company was like, I mean, we don't care what happens, so just ignore the fact that this thing is falling apart. But then they thought about it a little bit harder, and they were like, no, do you know what? If you paint it brown, people won't know that it's leaking because the molasses is brown. And I kid you not, they painted this thing brown and ignored all of these warning signs. So now skip ahead a few years. Now it's January 15th, 1919. 2 days before, the tank had just been filled, and it hadn't often been filled before, just like a handful of times. So it had just been filled up, and the molasses that they put in there, I think, was fairly warm. It was in January, and the weather on January 15th was a little bit warmer than usual. I think it was about 40 degrees, they said. And something to do with the temperature difference, along with the tank never having been structurally sound enough to hold all this molasses, caused chaos, okay? So this tank held 2.3 million gallons of molasses, and molasses apparently has pretty high potential energy, especially when you have it stacked 4 stories tall. So something happened. Oh, and I forgot to mention, even like the rivets holding this thing together were weak, and people had seen like cracks and fractures along them. So around 12:30 lunchtime, there was a huge explosion. The tank just shattered, and it created a tidal wave of molasses right in the north end. And I'm like not kidding, like the blast was huge. They said that the molasses was traveling 56 kilometers an hour, or 35 miles per hour, and there was like a 25-foot high wave of molasses. It threw people, the blast alone threw people like off their feet across the street. It knocked a train off the tracks, and the actual molasses itself just like surged forward in a like terrible sticky tsunami. It bent like the metal train tracks, like there was like one of those above ground train rails. It completely warped the steel and bent it, knocked houses off their foundations, like blew out windows. Like it was like a bomb had gone off. And in fact, later in court, they tried to say that it was a bomb that had gone off, but we'll get to that later. So now you have got this sudden catastrophe. It actually killed 21 people, injured 150 people, killed 25 horses, and it got really bad because they were stuck in molasses. It wasn't even like a water tsunami. So the molasses is really dense and sticky. And it only got worse from there for the people who were actually involved in this event. So that day in January, it had been like 40 degrees, but as the sun got lower and night fell, it got a lot colder. So instead of having pliable, sticky molasses, you had molasses that was starting to harden into like a gross shell. So they had all kinds of people who had to come and help. They had the Red Cross, the Boston Police, the Army, the Navy. All of these people came out to the north end and were just trying to help find the dead people and to save the people who were like literally stuck in molasses, which sounds like a ridiculous situation, but like I personally would not want to be in it. And so firsthand reports of this say that you couldn't even really identify people because some of the ones that had died who were covered in the molasses, their features were like dipped in sugar. They were like glazed over like a donut. That's bad to say because they died, but I mean, like, it's honestly a ridiculous situation. So they were having to like cut people out of like sticky molasses, and the ones who hadn't been killed by the blast also were having breathing problems because it got in their airways. So they had like inhaled molasses, which is like thick and gooey. So there were a lot of breathing problems with the people who didn't like die from just like the force of the impact. And of course you have to think that when the tank exploded, it also had debris flying everywhere. So it was like actually quite terrible. They said that it took 3 to 4 months just to find all the bodies, because some of them, it was right by the harbor, so some of them kind of like, I guess, were found in the water later. And then you have to think that the town was now covered in really sticky molasses. And this is just a side note. One time I moved into an apartment. It was my first apartment. It was so cheap, and I swear to God, it was covered in maple syrup. Like, it just smelled like maple syrup, and every time I would open a cabinet, like, my fingers would come away sticky. It was just in like the weirdest places, and I could never find it all to clean it. But imagine that for a whole city. They had to spray it down with salt water from the ocean, and even then it took like literally forever, because you had the people who came to help, and it would get stuck to their clothes, and they would ride the train, and then the train would be covered in sticky stuff. So like the whole city got like this molasses like spread all over it. And there are reports actually that for decades later, like into like now even, people say that on sunny days you can still smell the molasses. And like I said, I do live near here. I have been here. I have never smelled it smelling like molasses, but it kind of makes me want to go out there in the summer and just see. But I don't know, I kind of doubt it. That was literally 100 years ago, so it's probably all broken down by now. But I do believe that it took years and years and years for the smell to go away. So let's talk about the impact of this, right? So this totally irresponsible people killed a bunch of people. It like went to court. There was one of the first class action lawsuits about this, and the company was like, it wasn't our tank's fault. They were anarchists and they put a bomb in the tank. Totally not on us. But the judge did not buy it, y'all. He was like, no. And the laws actually changed. So there's some good that came out of this like terrible, ridiculous tragedy. So after this, they put in place that you actually had to have, I don't know, architects or structural engineers working on buildings, and you couldn't just have like any regular old jerk like construct like something in the middle of the city. So with the development of some actual, building codes, there was some good that came out of this terrible, ridiculous tragedy, which I hope that you enjoyed learning about on my Sims channel. If you like this build, it's on the gallery as the Laurence mansion, and I thought about the story of the Boston Molasses Flood because the Laurence mansion Little Women universe is in Concord, which is actually only like 20 miles or so from Boston. So find me on the gallery, follow me here. My name is BeccaTownSims, and I love you all. Thank you for watching.